Good day. This is the recorded lecture for week 7, and it covers Chapter 11 lecture. Chapter 11 and Chapter 12 focus on biodiversity, an important subject for environmental study. And Chapter 11 specifically looks at preserving species. We begin with a discussion about the northern spotted owl. The northern spotted owl lives in mixed old-growth forests in Washington, Oregon, and some parts of Northern California. It's known as the most controversial bird in the world because when it was designated as a threatened species in the 1990s, it pitted the logging industry against the species preservation community. Chapter 11 looks at the biodiversity of species. On your right is a picture of the northern spotted owl, and on your left is a picture of the barred owl, which is one of the common owls that you may see, and later on we'll see how the northern spotted owl is being affected by the barred owl. Protecting rare and endangered species is difficult and controversial. In this chapter, we'll look at some of the threats to rare and endangered species, as well as the reasons we may want to protect biodiversity and habitat for these species. This particular controversy pitted individual loggers and small sawmill owners against environmentalists. During the height of the controversy, bumper stickers reading "Kill a Spotted Owl, Say a Logger," and "I Like Spotted Owls, Fried" appeared on many vehicles up in this area, particularly in some of the logging towns. Plastic spotted owls were hung in effigy in Oregon sawmills. Initially, the logging industry estimated up to 30,000 of 168,000 jobs would be lost because of the owl's status, which agreed closely with the actual Forest Service estimate. Harvests of timber in the Pacific Northwest were reduced by 80%, decreasing the supply of lumber and increasing prices. Recently, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has designated 9.6 million acres of critical habitat for the northern spotted owl, which was nearly doubled the initial protections looked at in 1990 and also revised in 2008. So the spotted owl is kind of an interesting test case. The recent designation adds some acreage into the original protection, which was about 5.3 million acres. That includes some very highly productive timberlands on the Bureau of Land Management, or sort of managed by the Bureau of Land Management in southwest Oregon. This particular area was left out, was proposed in 1990, but was left out of the 2008 designation, which was under the Bush administration. One of the controversies of this acreage being in and out was that was over lawsuits, and part of the controversy was that different administrations have distorted the science around the spotted owl. So the spotted owl is rather complex because its habitat is highly dependent on old-growth forests, that is, forests that have not been logged at all. And those forests, particularly on private lands, are very hard to find these days. but they also depend on a fair amount of habitat around these old growth forests. So a lot of habitat needs to be set aside to protect these species. The spotted owl populations have been declining by nearly 3% per year, and that's over 40% in the last 25 years. But the issue is quite complex because part of the issue is the invasion of spotted owl territory by this other species of owl, the barred owl, which is moving west from the Rockies. The other issue is that the logging industry was also changing during this time period. Some of the job losses quoted by the Forest Service and the logging industry had to do with automation of some timber mills, very much like, you know, the job losses that have occurred in other manufacturing industries with the use of robotics and so on. So this is an example of how these species protection issues can get pretty complex. I've put some updates on the spotted owl issue on the website for you to take a look at. Despite the controversy, it's pretty well accepted in the scientific community that biodiversity is a vital resource that is being lost. At the end of the great exploration era of the 19th century, some scientists confidently declared that every important kind of living thing on Earth would soon be found and named. Most of those explorations focused on the charismatic species, such as birds and mammals. Recent studies of less conspicuous organisms, such as insects and fungi, suggest that millions of new species and varieties remain to be studied scientifically. Also keep in mind that this discussion is about species loss, not reductions in numbers of species that are still surviving in habitats around the world. So in my mind, we've got two issues. We've got the populations of species, but we also have the number of species. And so our raven study is kind of directed at this idea to look at developing some information around specifically ravens and possible bird losses. So the first thing we have to look at is, what is biodiversity? Within species diversity, we can distinguish between two measurements: species richness, which is the total number of species in a community, and species evenness, that is the relative abundance of individuals within species. Both of these are important. The species richness can be the same, but if you were to walk through some communities, you'd have the impression that a habitat with high species richness without numbers or species evenness is much less diverse. So you have to keep both of these in mind. Biodiversity includes genetic, species, and ecosystem diversity. So there are three levels. Previous chapters of the book have described some of the fascinating varieties of organisms and complex ecological relationships that give the biosphere, our biosphere, its unique and productive characteristics. This biodiversity is dependent on these three levels. Genetic diversity is the measure of the variety of different versions of the same genes with individual species. Species diversity describes the number of different kinds of organisms within individual communities or ecosystems. And ecological diversity or ecosystem diversity assesses the richness and complexity of a biological community, including the number of niches, the trophic levels, and the ecological processes that capture energy, sustain food webs, and recycle materials within this system. The 1.7 million species or so that are presently known probably represent only a small fraction of the total number that actually exist. We just talked about that in the previous slide. Based on the rate of new discoveries by research expeditions, especially in the tropics, taxonomists estimate that there may be somewhere between 3 million and 50 million different species alive today when you look at all levels of organisms and all types of organisms. In fact, some taxonomists have estimated that there might be 30 million species of tropical insects alone. The upper limits for these estimates assume a high degree of ecological specialization among these different types of organisms. A recent study in New Guinea, however, found that 51 plant species were host to 900 species of herbivorous insects. This would suggest no more than about 4 to 6 million insect species worldwide. The other thing you can see from this table is that the number of species is somewhat skewed, again, looking at the animals that we like to learn about, or the animals that are more easily found. So protected areas are established to slow the loss of biodiversity. And I think this is one of the important issues that I have. With my current understanding of the loss of biodiversity going on worldwide, the more we can conserve intact land that supports a diverse ecosystem, the better. Later on, we're going to look at urban sprawl and some of the other challenges associated with preserving landscapes. Conservation biology focuses on biodiversity hotspots. These are areas that have a large number of endangered and threatened species and have a concentration of endemic species that we have a chance of preserving if we preserve these specific areas. Hotspot designation tends to favor the most noticeable organisms, however. This map that you see is a map generated by an organization called Conservation International. The link is on your website. The current biodiversity hotspots tend to be in tropical or Mediterranean climates and on islands, coastlines, or mountains where many habitats exist and physical barriers tend to encourage speciation. Notice on this slide that the California floristic province is one of the biodiversity hotspots. The California floristic province in particular is a zone of Mediterranean type climates and has high levels of plant endemism, that is, and high levels of endemic plants characteristic of these regions. Our particular hotspot is home to the giant sequoia, which is the planet's largest living organism, and its taller but less massive relative, the coast redwood. This region also holds a number of threatened endemic species, such as the giant kangaroo rat, the desert slender salamander, and some of the last individuals of the critically endangered California condor can still be found here in our own state. The California condor in particular has the largest avian breeding ground in the United States, in our own particular state. Wilderness destruction, by commercial farming is the major threat for many of the California floristic province regions. And as you know, California is a huge agricultural state, generating over half of all the agricultural products used by U.S. consumers. Our hotspot is also heavily threatened by the expansion of urban areas, pollution, and road construction. It's one of the only 5 areas with a Mediterranean-type climate in the world. So California is particularly important. This is a picture of our tiger. There's a lot of concern about tigers in right now because tigers seem to be declining worldwide. And there's an estimate that we may not be able to support tigers in the wild after a decade or so. DNA analysis revealed that a new tiger subspecies occurs in Malaysia. So DNA technology looking at genetic diversity has become a new tool for conservation biology. As you know from modern court cases and paternity suits, we can use DNA sequences to identify individuals with a very high degree of certainty. So now this technology is being applied to identify species in nature. With DNA sequencing getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, many natural studies of species involve DNA sequencing. You can sample hair from scratching pads, so it's non-destructive to the animal. And you don't have to cause any trauma of them being captured. So the new tiger species in Malaysia was detected based on blood, skin, and fur samples from zoo and museum specimens, and also being compared to species around the world. Similar studies have shown that the northern spotted owl, our case study, is a genetically distinct subspecies from its close relatives, the California spotted owl and the Mexican spotted owl. So that's one of the basis of the evidence that the northern spotted owl needs continued protection. Wild tigers could become extinct in about 12 years if the countries where they still roam fail to take quick action to protect their habitats and step up the fight against poaching. Poaching is a particular problem because after gains on eliminating poaching in previous years, the poaching rates are increasing significantly in the past few years. Scientists estimate that about 100 years ago there were about 100,000 tigers in the world. Now there are less than 5,000. This is an area called the Myanmar Huklang Valley, where a major tiger reserve has been set up. The tiger lives in forested regions of Asia, Turkey, and the far eastern part of Russia. Humans built roads and cut down forests, destroying much of their habitat and their food source. Although tigers are protected, illegal hunting is a real threat, as I just mentioned. Tiger products are valued in many cultures, and because of the development and gaining incomes of many of these cultures, the poaching problem has become severe. One of the ways to look at biodiversity is look at the services provided by the biodiversity of ecosystems. We benefit from other organisms organisms in many ways, some of which we don't appreciate until a particular species or community disappears. Even seemingly obscure and insignificant organisms can play irreplaceable roles in ecological systems or be the source of genes or drugs that may someday be indispensable. So I think there's an economic argument for preserving biodiversity. And here's some examples. The rosy periwinkle is a source of anti-cancer drugs. Many conservationists argue that diversity had direct benefits to man as a source of genetic material, coding for substances that could become drugs or other cures for diseases. Losing this genetic storehouse was an argument to obtain funds and pass legislation to protect biodiversity. Mangosteens from Indonesia have been called the world's best tasting fruit, but they are practically unknown beyond the tropical countries where they grow naturally. There may be thousands of other traditional crops and wild food resources that could be equally valuable to us, grown appropriately and sustainably, but are threatened by extinction. You've probably bought a drink with acai in it. Acai is the latest craze to be put in energy drinks and fruit drinks and various kinds of beverage products. Wild acai berries grow in the Amazon rainforest. This is a picture showing how it's grown. Because of the demand for acai, some growers are cutting down forests to get access to these particular palm trees that produce them. So they're removing the biodiversity around the actual commercial product. On the other hand, these types of products, if sustainably grown, may provide financial benefits that can preserve biodiversity where these species occur. More than half of all the modern medicines that we use are derived from or modeled on natural compounds of wild species, as shown in this table. Part of the debate has to do with extinction as a process. Studies of the fossil record suggest that more than 99% of all species that ever existed are now extinct. Most of those species were gone long before humans came to the scene. Species arise through a process of mutation and natural selection, and they disappear in the same way as we described the concepts in Chapter 4. Often new forms replace their own parents. The tiny hippocampus, for instance, has been replaced by the much larger modern horse, but most of its genes probably still survive in its distant offspring. Periodically, mass extinctions have wiped out vast numbers of species and even whole families. You'll see this on the table in the next slide. The best study of these events occurred at the end of the Cretaceous period, when dinosaurs disappeared along with at least 50% of the existing genera and 15% of the marine animal families. An even greater disaster occurred at the end of the Permian period about 250 million years ago, when 95% of all marine species and nearly half of all the plant and animal families died out over a period of about 10,000 years, which is a pretty short time by geologic standards. Given these historical events, should humans be concerned? The current period is on par with a mass extinction event that has been studied in the past, and it's called the Holocene extinction event, and it's mostly humankind driven. This table shows some of the well-known extinction events, and you can see how the current period under Quaternary or Holocene compares. The rate at which species are disappearing have increased dramatically over the last 150 years. It appears that between 1600 and 1850, human activities were responsible for the extermination of 2 or 3 species per decade. By some estimates, we're now losing species at hundreds or even thousands of times natural rates. If present trends continue, the United Nations Environment Program warns that half of all primates and 1/4 of all bird species could be extinct in the next 50 years. The eminent biologist E.O. Wilson says that the impending biodiversity crash could be more abrupt than any previous mass extinction, which I find a little scary. Some biologists, as I've said, call this the 6th mass extinction event, but note that this time it's not any based on asteroids or volcanoes, but human impacts. The most important extinction threat for most species, especially terrestrial species, is habitat loss. So that's what we really need to think about, habitat loss. Perhaps the most obvious example of habitat destruction is the clear-cutting of forests and conversion of grasslands to crop fields. As the opening case study shows on the northern spotted owl, the greatest threat to the owls is the loss of old-growth forests on which they depend upon for nesting primarily. So these pictures depict what I mean. On the left is a virgin rainforest in Brazil with areas recently cleared for farming. On the right is a Google Earth image showing clear cuts surrounding Mount Hood National Forest, Oregon. We still depend on clear cutting to get our wood products to build our homes. And of course, many of our diverse lands, particularly in the breadbasket areas of our country, have been converted to agriculture. A portion of western Oregon and northern California shows that some of the 133 owl management areas identified by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Notice that while most of the habitat along the west side of the Cascade Mountains can support 20 or more pairs of breeding owls, most of the areas in the coastal range are already too degraded to support that many. So it's not just about preserving habitat. The habitat quality values have to be preserved or upgraded somehow. East of the Cascades, the forests are too fire-prone to reliably provide spotted owl habitat. So again, I'm working in the opening case study now and then here. The greatest threat to northern spotted owls is the loss of old-growth forests on which they depend. Before European settlement, almost all of this area would have been dense, structurally complex forest ideal for spotted owls. Although patches of the habitat remain, many have been so degraded by human activities, note the yellow areas, that they will no longer support a healthy number of pairs of breeding owls. A major threat to native biodiversity in many places is from accidentally or deliberately introduced species. So we mentioned the barred owl as another problem for the northern spotted owl. Although the barred owl is native to North America, it's been invading into human-altered habitats and therefore is affecting the northern spotted owl. The term invasive species includes a variety of names. We call them alien, exotic, non-native, non-indigenous, unwanted, disruptive, or invasive species. All of these terms are organisms that move into new territory. These migrants often flourish because they are free of predators, diseases, and other resource limitations that may have controlled their populations in their native habitats. Although humans have probably transported organisms into new habitats for thousands of years, the rate of movement has increased sharply in recent years because of the huge increase in speed and volume of travel by air, water, and land. This picture shows the brown tree snake. This snake arrived as a stowaway on a cargo plane going to Guam. The snake proliferated on that island, and soon 3 of the native birds known only to that island became globally extinct. The rest of the 11 species of native birds populations became perilously low. So officials have taken the remaining species into protective custody in zoos. To date, they have not figured out how to control the populations of brown snakes. We move species around the world in a variety of ways. Some are deliberately released because people believe they will be aesthetically pleasing or economically beneficial. Your book highlights some examples from this figure. I'm going to highlight a few of these that are relative to California. Note the Russian thistle, which is on the far bottom left. Russian thistle is a large and bushy, noxious annual broadleaf plant. It occurs throughout the western United States, more often in drier areas. Russian thistle can also create a fire hazard or hinder traffic when it breaks off from its main stem, dries up, and gets blown in the wind. So that's where we get the name tumbleweed. You probably remember some old westerns that they show these weeds tumbling throughout the West. It is a summer annual native to southeastern Russia and western Siberia, and it was first introduced into the United States in 1873 by Russian immigrants as a contaminant in flaxseed brought to South Dakota. Now I'm going to look at Scotch broom, which is on your right, second from the bottom. Brooms are a group of shrubs introduced into North America from Europe in the mid-1980s. There are 4 common species: Scotch broom, French broom, Spanish broom, and Portuguese broom. They were initially introduced as ornamentals, and they are very showy. They're starting to bloom now in the spring. And also they were used because they had some value for erosion control. So they were introduced for erosion control along roadsides and mined areas. They're highly competitive shrubs, and they grow rapidly, and they form dense stands that most wildlife find impenetrable and unpalatable. So part of the problem with these species that get brought over here is our wildlife species may not be adapted to use them, recognize them, or they may be unpalatable to our particular wildlife diversity. Their dense stems make regeneration of most plant species difficult or impossible, and they create a dangerous fire hazard. The broom seeds travel along roadsides, and they're becoming a problem throughout the Bay Area and also the state. Next time you drive up into the Sierras, you will probably notice this species, especially when it's blooming, and you can see that it just follows the roads. They are of particular concern on San Bruno Mountain, where they compete with the rare butterfly host plants, and also in the Sierras, where they're invading native forests. This is another species that you may recognize, shown here. Cordaderia jubata, or jubata grass, is a large perennial grass found on the coast of California and in the coast ranges. The other term we also use is pampas grass. There are actually different species. So this is the invasive pampas grass, if you want to think about it that way, and this is jubata grass is the correct term. Jubata grass favors dunes, bluffs, and disturbed areas, including inland areas where temperatures are modified by fog. It was introduced as an ornamental plant for erosion control. Each plume produces up to 100,000 seeds that are widely dispersed by wind and develop without fertilization. Jubata grass quickly colonizes bare ground, but establishment is generally poor where the seedlings must compete with other grasses or sedges. So if you notice, I go on Devil's Slide a lot because I live on the coast, but that's what happens. Bare soil gets exposed, and then the jubata grass kind of takes over from there. Large infestations of jubata grass threaten California's coastal ecosystems by crowding out native species, particularly in sensitive coastal dune areas. From a health standpoint, the leaves have these sawtooth margins on them, and they can cause injury to humans. And as I said, an individual inflorescence can produce 100,000 seeds. Flowering occurs late July to September, after most other species have flowered. And some plants can flower twice during the same growing season. The tiny seeds are spread up to 20 miles from the mother plant by wind. This is an example of another local situation. You can see the red-legged frog here, the red frog on your left, and the beautiful San Francisco garter snake on your right. The San Francisco garter snake is an endangered species that is uniquely found in the San Francisco Bay Area, and the red-legged frog has a more wide distribution. It was throughout much of California, but has been extirpated from a lot of areas of California, but is still found locally. So part of the sources of destruction for this species are habitat destruction, but introduced species from the bullfrog that you see in the middle here is a major problem for both the red-legged frog and the San Francisco garter snake. So the bullfrog, being a larger frog, preys on the smaller red-legged frog and also the young snakes. Another threat to species is the bioaccumulation or biological magnification process. Biological magnification, for example, of PCBs, which were found in many transformers on our electric system, for example, and also in machinery. When these got into the soil and got onto the soil, PCBs function as an endocrine disruptor that masculinizes females and feminizes males. Their behavior in breeding was thus disrupted. DDT, also talked about before in the class, led to eggshell thinning in birds of prey, such as the herring gull and the osprey and the peregrine falcon shown here. So these substances concentrate at the low ends of the food chain, as you can see here. And you can see how the concentrations get up to dangerous levels in these higher trophic level or apex predators. Overexploitation is another major threat, and we've talked about this quite a bit already, particularly in the fishing industry. Bushmeat and trade in medicinal products that I mentioned under the tiger example that are extracted from wildlife species is also a resurging problem right now. One of the major sources of destruction of many birds that occurred during the Victorian and Edwardian era, where hats were worn and native bird feathers were used to outfit those hats. So we've got a kind of a long and continuing history of overexploitation of species. This slide, and I'm sorry for the graphic nature of the slide, shows lemurs killed for bushmeat in Madagascar and results of a bushmeat hunt of a baboon and an antelope in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And this came from an article in National Geographic. A hunter in Cameroon was allowed to keep the head of a female gorilla after handing over the carcass for a bushmeat order. And so you can see how destructive these things can be. The passenger pigeon is an example of a species hunted to extinction. The species lived in enormous migratory flocks until the early 20th century, when hunting and habitat destruction led to its extinction. Pigeon meat was a source of cheap meat for the poor in the 19th century in the United States. This is an example of how even a ubiquitous and abundant species can go extinct. The hyacinth macaw is an endangered species due to overcollection for the cage bird trade and habitat loss, and is registered as a protected endangered species in many countries. The last slide on the lower right here is cyanide fishing. Fishermen dive into the sea where they spray cyanide poison between individual layers of the habitat, where they collect fish for the aquarium trade. Some fish are harvested to eat, but they have to be cleaned by storing them in the tank to remove the cyanide from the fish so they're not endangered to humans. So this is used for hunting particular fish and also for the aquarium trade. Many fish brought up this way do not survive the capture process. So the targeted fish that are actually captured often don't survive, so they have to collect higher numbers. And of course the cyanide will poison the fish that are left behind in these ecosystems. This slide depicts the collapse of the northern cod fishery off Newfoundland. So this was a major commercial fishery for many years and is now collapsed. And so far it has not recovered. So this is another case study that I think that we feature in this book. When settlers first arrived in the U.S., they spoke of Atlantic cod that was so thick the fish swam end to end in the rivers. The northern cod fishery, which for the past 500 years had largely shaped the lives and communities of Canada's eastern coast, was a major commercial fishery that supported many jobs and livelihoods. A major factor that contributed to the depletion of the cod stocks off the shores included introduction and proliferation of equipment and technology that increased the volume of landed fish. For centuries, local fishermen used technology that limited the volume of their catch in the area that they fished and let them target specific species and ages of fish. But from the 1950s onwards, it was common in all industries to use new technology that allowed fishermen to trawl a larger area, fish and catch fish to a deeper depth and for a longer time. By the 1960s, powerful trawlers equipped with electronic navigation systems and sonar allowed crews to pursue fish with huge success in terms of haul rates. So these catches peaked in the late 1970s and 1980s. The new technologies adversely affected the northern cod population in two important ways. By increasing the area and depth that was fished, the cod were being depleted until the surviving fish could not replenish the stock lost each year. And secondly, the trawlers caught enormous amounts of non-commercial fish, which were economically unimportant, but ecologically were important to feed the cod and other species. So incidental catch undermines the whole ecosystem and can deplete the stocks of the important species as well as all the other species. With the northern cod, significant amounts of capelin, an important prey species for the cod, were caught as bycatch, they call it, and so these species that were additionally caught were thrown away and ended up causing the collapse. You can do your part to protect biodiversity by choosing fish species that are more sustainably managed. You can download this pocket guide from the Monterey Bay Aquarium. About 1/3 of marine fish species are already in a state of population collapse. If current trends continue, you can see the projection here. All saltwater fish may reach this state by 2050. An important treaty called CITES is an agreement that implements regulations, and this is actually an international treaty. It's called the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wildlife, Flora, and Fauna, so that's where you get the acronym. The regulations from this treaty are incorporated into our U.S. Endangered Species Act. So this convention, which was established in 1975, was a significant step towards worldwide protection of endangered flora and fauna. It regulated trade in living specimens and products derived from listed species, but it has not been foolproof. Species are smuggled out of countries where they are threatened or endangered, and documents are falsified to make it appear that they come from areas where species are still common. Investigations and enforcement are especially difficult in developing countries where wildlife is disappearing most rapidly. Still, eliminating markets for endangered wildlife is an effective way to stop poaching. So this slide shows some examples of some extinct species, some of them already mentioned. The Mauritius dodo, the Guam flying fox, the Chinese river dolphin, these are roughly counterclockwise, or clockwise I mean, passenger pigeon, the eastern elk, the blue pike, and the Southern California kit fox, which is a more local example. There's a number of ways that we protect species, particularly in our own country. Hunting laws are one. General protection under fish and game codes. In California, we have a fish and game code that's particularly restrictive and protects most of our wildlife species in some form or another. Endangered species protection laws. So these include the Federal Endangered Species Act, or ESA, the California Endangered Species Act, or CESA, C-E-S-A. It's an interesting statistic that only 1% of listed species has actually gone extinct, compared to 10% of proposed species that have gone extinct. And unfortunately, I don't have a number for unlisted species, but you can see the benefits of species protection laws here. I'm going to go through some endangered species legislation concepts. Pages 236 to 241 describe some of the ways endangered species protection legislation works, so you can read that. But this slide reviews some specific concepts. First of all, a species has to be listed, and generally there are two types, endangered or threatened. The idea is to list some species and keep them under threatened status and prevent their extinction. Most of these laws work on the concept of take. That is, take is not allowed. Take can not just mean that a species is killed. It can mean harm, harass, collect, and a variety of other terms. So the laws will actually list terms that apply to what we call take. The other way the laws work is incidental, that is, take of a species conducting an otherwise lawful activity is also prohibited unless you get a permit. And then the permit can then regulate activities such as construction projects that minimize the chance of incidental take. We talked about the designation of critical habitat when we looked at the northern spotted owl example. So when a species is listed, critical habitat has to be designated. And so there are additional activities focused on protecting that designation of habitat. Very often the amount of acreage put into critical habitat can be controversial. Another requirement of our U.S. law is that a recovery plan needs to be established for the species. Another part of the law is the setting up of habitat conservation plans. These are specific plans that allow certain kinds of private activities to take place in certain areas. An example on San Bruno Mountain, which has residential development, has utility corridors going through it, there's a habitat conservation plan established that protects the endangered butterfly species on that local mountain in our Bay Area. Also, captive or experimental populations are important to allowed under these laws under certain conditions and can be very crucial. For example, the California condor was basically prevented from going extinct by allowing captive rearing of condors, where eggs could be hatched safely and the young could be safely grown to adulthood and then released into the wild population. In some cases, such as fish, we designate what's called ecological significant units, or ESUs. So for example, the Chinook salmon, we can't really list the Chinook salmon as a species because different groups of salmon migrate upstream at different times in different ways. So we basically subdivide the species into what's called ecological significant units. And those migrations are managed. There are some success stories. When we get into these environmental lectures, sometimes I feel that they're doom and gloom. And I do like the fact that your book does give a balanced approach here. So I want to move to success stories. Our bald eagle is one. It was delisted from the Federal Endangered Species Act in 2007. The species was heavily impacted by habitat destruction, but also DDT, much like the osprey and the peregrine falcon and our other raptors. After establishing protection under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act and then later the Endangered Species Act, habitat was protected and the bioaccumulation conditions were solved. So it has been delisted in the lower 48 states. So the bald eagles were down to 500 breeding pairs, but now it's estimated that they have a healthy breeding level and also areas where they can thrive in their habitat. Here are some other success stories. The brown pelican, which migrates up to our coast, is one. The gray whale is coming back. The peregrine falcon is coming back. You may note that we've got a pair that nests in the city of San Francisco. There's also some pairs that nest along our coast. The Virginia northern flying squirrel, the Aleutian Canada goose, and the whooping crane are all some examples. In spite of some success, there is much work that professionals can do with the help of citizens to preserve biodiversity. An example of biodiversity maps is shown here, and these studies of biodiversity as located in on land is important. This study showed that few of the areas of endangered species richness are actually protected in preserves, which were selected more for scenery or recreation value than for their biology. So these studies are important in terms of helping us learn to manage what to do in these areas. So this is looking at the island of Hawaii, which has many invasive and endangered species issues. Captive breeding programs, I think, are also important. Zoos have been somewhat controversial, but breeding programs in zoos and botanical gardens are one way to attempt to save severely threatened species. Until fairly recently, zoos depended on primarily wild-caught animals for most of their collections, and this did contribute to the drain on wild populations. But now that's been changed. With better understanding of reproductive biology and better breeding facilities, most mammals in North American zoos are now produced by captive breeding programs. Some zoos now participate in programs that reintroduce endangered species to the wild. The California condor is one of the best-known cases of a successful captive breeding program. In 1986, only 9 of these birds existed in their native habitat. During the loss of these last condors, biologists captured them and brought them to the San Diego and Los Angeles zoos, where they had begun breeding programs in the 1970s. By 2010, the population had reached 381 birds, and 192 have been reintroduced to the wild. So this is our California condor. So a little bit about this bird, because I think it's one of our improving success stories. It's a large black vulture with patches of white on the underside of the wings. It has the largest wingspan of any bird found in North America and is one of the heaviest. It's a scavenger and eats large amounts of carrion, and it's one of the world's longest living birds, living up to 50 years. Condor numbers dramatically declined in the 20th century due to poaching, lead poisoning, and habitat destruction. And eventually a conservation plan was put in place that led to the capture of all the remaining wild condors in 1987. These 22 birds were bred, and leading to what's now the 192 birds that are released in the wild. This is one of the other points that I want to make is that the recovery of these extremely endangered species can be very expensive. The California condor was one of the most expensive. So the idea of preserving habitat, preserving biodiversity hotspots, listing species before they're critically endangered helps save money. So this is a little slide showing you how the captive breeding program works. One of the things that we learned is we have to avoid human contact. So you can see the puppet that's used to feed the hatchling condors. And this is a condor being released into the wild in the lower right of your slide. So this is a review of biodiversity protection concepts, and this is our last slide. Biodiversity provides food, fiber, medicines, clean water, and many other products and services that we depend on every day but may not appreciate. Yet nearly 1/3 of the native species in the United States are at risk of disappearing. The Endangered Species Act has proven to be one of the most powerful tools we have for environmental protection. Because of its effectiveness, the Act itself is endangered. Some opponents have succeeded in limiting its scope. It needs to be reauthorized, and that is often the opportunity to cut down on its effectiveness. And in some years, it's been debated to eliminate it altogether. Still, the Act remains as a cornerstone of our basic environmental protections. It has given new hope for survival to numerous species that were on the brink of extinction. Some examples have been given to you. And again, this statistic is quite important. Less than 1% of species listed under this Act have gone extinct.